Before I begin today, I'd like to give a shout out to the Bird of Prey 5 channel and Bird of Prey 5 himself. This seemed like the most appropriate video to do so in for obvious reasons. Bird of Prey 5, or Joe as I've come to know him, is himself a story of human perseverance. Confined to a bed for about a decade now, Bird manages to keep himself employed and maintain a pretty successful YouTube channel where you can find him regularly streaming and having a good time right along with his audience. Despite his current physical limitations, Bird keeps busy. He's so busy he makes a German industrial tycoon look like an American welfare case. Check him out and see if his humor is right for you. Also, before I begin, I just want to mention that my book, Captain Steele and Other Stories, is available on Amazon. It's a small collection of speculative fiction that I wrote mostly while I was serving on USS Trepang years ago. Gene Shalit called it a delightful romp. Or at least he would if he, reviewed books. And wasn't retired. Okay, moving on. So just over a year ago, I did a video for the Salt Vampires channel called the Klingon Bird of Prey from a Submariner's Perspective. Like all of the videos I did for the Salt Vampire, they no longer exist. At least not there. Faced with the choice of uploading a year-old video or redoing it and trying to make it just a little bit better, I opted for the second choice. I maintain, as a fully qualified submarine veteran of the United States Navy, that no other regularly seen vessel in the Star Trek franchise has as much in common with modern submarines and submarine warfare as the Klingon Bird of Prey. I am, of course, referring to the Paramount version of this ship, not the abomination that is the secret hideout version, seen in the travesty men call Star Trek Discovery. The Paramount version, which from this point forward in the video I will simply refer to as the Bird of Prey, debuted in the film Star Trek III: The Search for Spock. The film was depicted as a small scout-sized combat vessel with a crew, according to Sulu, of about a dozen personnel. The ship's signature feature, apart from being bird-shaped, was that it was equipped with a stealth feature called a cloaking device. The cloaking device is, depending on the depiction, a piece of equipment or an onboard system that enables a ship to become effectively invisible, both visually and to enemy sensors. The Klingon Empire was not the first nation in Star Trek to have this kind of technology, nor were they the only ones to have it. But given how often the Klingon Bird of Prey is depicted on Star Trek after Star Trek III, it is perhaps the ship that most Star Trek fans most think about when the term cloaking device is mentioned in casual conversation. The Bird of Prey is a bit of a contradiction in design. While it has a bird-like shape complete with wings, it is not as graceful looking as a ship modeled after a bird would tend to be. The interior designs feature heavy, dimly lit industrial looks, including exposed hydraulics and lots of exhaust. The overall impression is that the Bird of Prey isn't modeled after a graceful modern falcon, but rather a prehistoric monster like a pterosaur. Despite the presence of wings, which lends itself to the idea of a fighter jet comparison, the Klingon Bird of Prey is most often depicted engaging in submarine-like operations within the Star Trek universe. The whole ship seems to be designed around the cloaking device. The Bird of Prey is lightly armed compared to other Star Trek ships, equipped with one forward torpedo launcher and two massive wing-mounted weapons called disruptors. There is on-screen evidence that at least one Bird of Prey also had an aft torpedo launcher, but generally speaking, they usually seem to have just the forward one. The Bird of Prey was featured in 5 Star Trek films. In the last film featuring the original cast, the Bird of Prey was featured in the climactic Battle of Kittimer, where it managed to briefly hold off both the Enterprise and the new Excelsior starship. The Bird of Prey was defeated only when Kirk and crew managed to figure out how to get around the ship's cloaking device. Once that happened, the Bird of Prey was easily destroyed by the 2 larger and more heavily armed ships. In the very next film, an out-of-date Bird of Prey managed to do something that not even the powerhouses of the Romulan Star Empire and Borg Collective were able to do. This Bird of Prey managed to destroy the Enterprise D from Star Trek's Next Generation. It was able to do this thanks to a crucial component in submarine warfare: intel. Thanks to some covert surveillance, The Klingons managed to learn what frequency the Enterprise D's shields were operating at and were able to attenuate their weapons accordingly, rendering said shields pretty much useless. Despite being ridiculously outgunned by the Galaxy-class starship, the Bird of Prey's torpedo launcher and 2 disruptor cannons managed to destroy the Federation flagship soon after being destroyed herself, when the Enterprise D finally managed to return fire. Incidentally, the Enterprise D was also using intel to accomplish this as well. I remember a discussion I had while attending university after I'd served on USS Trepang. The discussion was with an armchair intellectual Star Trek fan who said he couldn't buy the idea of a bird of prey destroying the Enterprise. My response was that my submarine could sink an aircraft carrier, which is the closest real-world equivalent. Submarines, like birds of prey, are designed to approach an enemy by stealth, observe the enemy, and then attack with little to no warning. They are ambush predators, if you will. Both submarines and birds of prey have similar limitations in that both vehicles cannot fire weapons and remain stealthed at the same time. With one exception, birds of prey have to decloak before they can fire in order to divert energy to their weapons. In the case of submarines, however, the act of firing weapons itself gives away a submarine's position, since submarine stealth revolves around sound silencing technology and tactics. The results are very similar. Both ships cannot fire at an enemy without giving away their position and being open to attack themselves. Throughout most of the ship's history, the Klingon Bird of Prey was depicted as a cannon fodder ship, a ship that was there to challenge and be destroyed by the hero ship in the story, which was usually an Enterprise. But starting in the television series Star Trek Deep Space Nine, things began to change for the Bird of Prey. It began taking on a more heroic persona. In the series, Gul Dukat briefly went from being an antagonist to a protagonist, and, perhaps to really hit this home, the makers of the show gave him something in common with Captain Kirk. Gul Dukat began using a captured Klingon Bird of Prey as his personal ship. Later still, the show got a semi-recurring character called General Martok, a grizzled old Klingon warrior who commanded a bird of prey named the Rotaran. Under the command of Martok, suddenly the Klingon Bird of Prey became a far more effective combat vessel. Instead of being destroyed all the time, the Rotaran was shown kicking ass all the time. Martok and the Rotaran were routinely shown to be able to defeat 3 Jem'Hadar beetle ships at a time. It was refreshing to finally see a Klingon who knew how to fight using a bird of prey after so many years of them being used as vehicles by thugs and would-be dictators who apparently didn't know how to use them. In 1997, USS Trepang was far from home in the Mediterranean Sea. While I was kind of known as the Star Trek guy on the boat by this point, since I had a lot of episodes on VHS that we would watch together in the crew's mess, by late in the deployment I was all out of episodes to show the crew. A friend of mine had his wife back home tape an episode of Deep Space Nine and ship it to us while we were out there in the Med. The tape came to the boat while we were in Italy, and this episode was called Soldiers of the Empire. The story was about Martok being awarded the command of the Rotaran, which at the time was a dishonored ship. A ship that was known more for retreating from battle rather than for victories. Martok and Worf managed to transform the ship and crew by getting them to love their jobs again. This episode was viewed by USS Trepang at a time when our own morale was at a very low point, and as ridiculous as this may sound to some of you out there, this little story helped us a little bit.
3DO, a hero, betrayed.
Mask him.
Befriended. Banished. Warriors of Might and Magic on PlayStation 2 computer entertainment system. Rated T for teen.
Aileron.
Be there.
My commanding officer was particularly fascinated with the episode and would occasionally paraphrase General Martok when addressing the crew. He borrowed the tape and showed it to the wardroom. There was a scene in the episode where Martok is looking at a Klingon iPad, and he's reading the list of infractions that the Rotaran has earned for herself. From a U.S. naval perspective, The infractions start with the worst and become less severe as he goes down the list, but Martok's voice indicates that it is the opposite for Klingons. Dishonorable conduct, dereliction of duty, inattention to orders, unmotivated, and insufficiently aggressive. My captain loved that last one. He would find reasons to use the term sufficiently or insufficiently aggressive whenever he would address the crew. A valid question one might be asking is, why was Martok able to kick so much ass in a Bird of Prey when so many other captains ended up turning their ships into cannon fodder? Well, I can think of one clue. In the episode Sons and Daughters, we can hear Martok give an interesting order to his subordinates.
Engineering, reroute all auxiliary power to the disruptors. Disengage overload suppressor.
Disengage the overload suppressor. While other shows like Voyager throw technobabble around like confetti at a party, Deep Space Nine didn't so much. Usually, what they said had some meaning beyond just sounding good. On Voyager, it was like, increase to Flash Gordon noise and put more science stuff around. On Deep Space Nine, we get disengage the overload suppressor. So Martok is telling us, or rather his underlings, to turn off something that would normally prevent an overload. An overload is when you apply too much power to something. If Martok was in the habit of routinely disengaging such a thing, that would explain why his ship was so much more successful at blowing up enemy ships than previous Birds of Prey were. If one continues to watch Star Trek Into the Enterprise series, the crew of the NX-01 shows us what happens when your energy weapons are overloaded. It happened during the NX-01's phase cannon test in the episode Silent Enemy.
I just asked for a little off the top.
The blast yield was 10 times what we expected.
What happened?
Something overloaded the phase modulators.
Later on in the episode, Archer is forced to overload his weapons on purpose in order to defeat the titular Silent Enemy.
We're ready, sir.
Then fire.
It makes sense that Martok would routinely overload his weapons to gain an advantage, unlike what we saw from Starfleet crews, who are always more preoccupied with safety and efficiency. Klingon crews are there to fight. They're there to destroy other ships. It's a fundamental difference between an organization designed primarily to explore versus one primarily designed to conquer. The Klingons don't make multi-purpose ships the same way the Federation does. They make warships that are supposed to go out, blow a bunch of things up, and come back for significant repairs. Needless to say, of all the ships in Star Trek, the ones we felt the most kinship with in the submarine service back then were the Klingon Birds of Prey. Let's look at how a typical Bird of Prey compares in size to the USS Trepang. Thanks once again to Metaball Studios for this wonderful little size comparison animation. While there's lots of evidence out there that Birds of Prey come in a myriad of different sizes, this one is based on the Brel class, a ship version that was featured on Star Trek The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and roughly matches the approximate size of the Rotaran and Ducat's Bird of Prey. Bernd Schneider over at the website Ex Astra Scientia may disagree, but that's for him to do. The exact crew complement of a Brel is not known, but it's probably somewhere between 30 and 90 given how many people we see eating in the crew's mess at a given time. If, like on a submarine, about 1/3 of the crew eats at a time, we can get a pretty good idea of how big the Rotaran's crew is, but it's all still conjectural. Trepang had a crew of 90 to 100 personnel depending on deployment type, so even if the Bird of Prey had upwards of around that many personnel, they still enjoyed much more room than we did. In looking at this animation, I'm still impressed with the Bird of Prey's weapon-to-ship size ratio. There's just no mistaking what those things on the wingtips are meant to do, or what are supposed to come out of the great big hole in the front of the ship. Thanks for watching.